Hi, everyone. Welcome to our G2I community event. We're so happy to have you join us today. We are speaking about embracing neurodiversity in tech, developing with ADHD. This is a topic that has been highly requested by our developer community at G2I. And so we're really fortunate and excited to have a guest with us. Then we can dive into this topic in more detail. But before we get started, I wanted to introduce myself and G2I. So my name is Michelle Bakels. I'm a program director at G2I. I focus on developer health, so anything to support the mental and physical health of software developers. And at G2I, we have a mission to create custom talent pipelines so that your company doesn't have to. We have a unique approach that combines customizable vetting, flexible terms, and tailored customer service that gives us an advantage. So whether you're hiring 1,000 engineers to work on complex AI projects or highly skilled individuals for your MVP, we can scale to your needs. And right now, you can go to free.g2i.co and get one free introduction by our team to a talented engineer in the G2I community. So at no cost for the introduction. If you like them, you can also hire them at no cost. And we have 3 slots available for this month left for that. So last note, we grew up in the open source ecosystem, and so we host our annual software developers conference every April. It's called React Miami, and it is officially live. So if you go to reactmiami.com, you can see all of the details on that. So as far as today's event go, we're actually trying Zoom events platform for the very first time. But it is very similar if you've been a part of our events before, sort of the rules for engagement. So there are separate channels for regular chat and for questions. So we're going to start off with a presentation, and then at the end, we're going to do Q&A. So if you have any questions along the way, put them in the Q&A chat and we will answer those when we get to the Q&A section. Any other thoughts that you have or anything that you want to add to the conversation, please feel free to discuss in the chat and add along the way. We'd love to hear your thoughts as we go through this. We also have emoji reactions. So feel free to hit any emoji reactions throughout the presentation. Highly encouraged if there's anything that really resonates with you. And then this is recorded, so there will be a recording available afterwards. So with that said, I would love to introduce our guest, Versavia Ephraim. She's an accomplished software engineer, tech mentor, career coach, and mental health advocate. She's sharing her unique perspectives on ADHD in the tech industry, focusing first on understanding the condition and then exploring strategies of success. So with that said, Versavia, thank you so much for coming and being our guest today and sharing your knowledge here. I'll hand this off to you to take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Michelle. Okay, so I am going to share my screen, and someone can give me a thumbs up once you see it. That would be great. Although it seems like everything cool. Awesome. Oh, whoops. I'm so sorry. I need to jump to the beginning of my presentation. Sorry. Some technical difficulties, of course. Okay, so let me share my screen again. Okay. Embracing neurodiversity in tech, developing with ADHD. So we all know the stereotypical ADHD kid. Fidgety, can't sit still, disrupts everyone, can't focus. These behaviors are, well, highly disruptive. So they were the easiest to spot, identify, and quantify. And so these are the behaviors that we associate with ADHD. But now we know, now that we have tools that let us observe the brain with a lot more granularity, like fMRI, EEG, with these tools, we can see what's different in ADHD brains. So now we have a much better understanding of the often silent symptoms that come with it. So today I'm going to talk about what is ADHD, what causes ADHD, how is ADHD treated, and having ADHD as a developer. So what is ADHD? In a single sentence, ADHD is a condition that robs you of the ability to ignore impulses. It's a deficit in the brain's executive functioning that makes it difficult to regulate and organize your behavior over time to best prepare for the future. We'll talk a little bit more about this, particularly executive functioning later, but first let's talk about symptoms. I'm not going to rehash the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. You can easily look that up. Instead, I'd like to talk about the symptoms that are frequent challenges among the ADHD community and might not be well known among the general population. Regulating focus. We have an inability to regulate our focus. It's not that we can't focus, it's that we can't regulate our focus. We're either not focused or hyper-focusing. Transitions. It's not that the task is difficult to do, it's transitioning into the task that's difficult, and I'll touch more on this later. Time blindness. We have a poor sense of time and poor time management skills. Again, I'll touch on this later. Prioritizing. We struggle to do the thing that's important to do right now. We have poor habit formation. Yes, we actually do need to remind ourselves to brush our teeth every single time. I'll talk more on this later as well. And then lastly, organizing and planning is a challenge. So let's talk about what causes ADHD. There are three main things I'll talk about here: genes, executive function, and the DMN. So when it comes to ADHD, it's highly hereditary. So if an immediate family member like parents, children, siblings, if they have ADHD, up to 1/3 of the family will also have ADHD. If a parent has ADHD, up to half of their children will also have ADHD. ADHD has been found in all countries and ethnic groups that have been studied to date. And so far, we found 12 genes with reliable association with ADHD, and they're exploring another 10 to 15 places. Now, I start with this for a very specific reason, and that's because I really want to emphasize that this is not a made-up disease and that the symptoms it causes are largely driven by biology. So let's talk about executive function. But first, actually, a brief foray into the brain. One way of thinking about the brain is evolutionarily. We have our reptilian brain, which is the brainstem and cerebellum back here of the head, and is responsible for our survival state. Our autonomic functioning, it's what tells your heart to beat or your lungs to filter oxygen. Then we have our mammalian brain, our limbic system, our emotional brain, our emotional center. This is where fight or flight lives, where our emotions, love, curiosity, fear, anger, our limbic system governs that. And then we have our primate brain. This is our prefrontal cortex, our our neocortex. This is our executive state. This is the skills that separate us from most other animals. Things like planning, thinking about the future, thinking about the past, emotion regulation, impulse control. So now back to our regularly scheduled programming. What is executive function? So executive functions are actions directed at ourselves, the mental activities we engage in when we think about our future and what we should be doing to get there and make it better. There's a total of 7 different actions that we use to monitor our own behavior, stop ourselves, think things over, guide our eventual behavior, all while controlling our emotions and motivations to optimize our success at attaining our goals. Now, these 7 functions are, briefly, self-awareness, inhibition, nonverbal working memory, think of that as your visual and spatial memory, verbal working memory, emotion regulation, self-motivation, and planning and problem solving. Now, in ADHD, there is a deficit of activity and connection in the parts of the brain responsible for executive function. So the parts of the brain that is responsible for these behaviors has a deficit of activity and connection. So what happens when this executive function, when it fails? When our primate brain isn't serving us, we rely on an older system in our brain, our limbic system, our emotional brain, to get us moving, to get us doing the thing. But the thing with the limbic system is that it's not very good at executing. It didn't evolve for execution. It evolved for emotions, for priorities. So unless emotions are involved and the emotions are loud, the limbic system won't drive execution of a task. So say you have a PR to work on. Until the volume of the emotion is cranked up to 10, until it's urgent or fascinating or some other emotion, gonna have a hard time transitioning into that task. Gonna have a hard time getting started on that PR. So needing emotions to be at volume 10 is why transitioning between tasks is hard. It is also why we can hyperfocus, because when the emotion is cranked up to volume 10, we're all in. So then that begs the question, why does our executive functioning fail? Researchers are still investigating this, of course, but one thing that we do know is that everyone's favorite neurotransmitter, dopamine, is involved. ADHD brains have an aggressive deficit of dopamine. And dopamine is a key player in a lot of things, including our reward system and our motivation. So since our dopamine circuits don't work typically, we're not getting a reward for doing the thing, whatever the thing is. So our likelihood of doing the thing next time doesn't increase the way that it does in a neurotypical brain. So think of it like trying to train a dog, but you don't have treats to train the dog. Is it possible? Theoretically, yes, sure, it's possible. But you're also going to have a hard time doing it. So this is one of the reasons why we struggle to form habits. Time blindness, as I mentioned, is actually also dopamine is a crucial component in our sense of time. So because we have a dopamine deficit, we have time blindness, and it tends to take one of two shapes. No sense of the passage of time, 5 minutes, 2 hours, I have no idea. Without a clock, we don't have that internal sense of time passing. And then there's this ADHD is spending a day in waiting mode because I have a thing at 1 p.m. I don't really know how to describe it, but this kind of thought pattern is common in ADHD brains. So we've talked about genes, talked about executive function. Now let's talk about the DMN. What is the DMN and why should you care? So the DMN is the default mode network. And to talk about it, we're actually first going to talk about a different network, the task positive network. So when researchers study the brain of someone who is engaged in a specific task or goal, regardless of what that task might be, there are certain parts of the brain that light up. So these parts, these networks, they call the task positive network. Now, the TPN is responsible for maintaining our attention on a specific task or on external stimuli, for complex cognitive tasks like problem solving and making decisions, managing and manipulating information in the short term, our working memory, inhibiting distractions and staying focused on the task at hand. That's also part of the TPN. And of course, goal-directed behaviors that require coordinated planning and execution. And this is all part of the TPN. Now, when someone isn't engaged in a task, when the brain is at rest, when we are awake but not involved in any particular mental exercise, when researchers looked at the brain in that state, they expected the brain to be fairly quiet, but they were very surprised to see the brain light up with activity. So this activity that the brain defaults to is what they call the default mode network. Now, the DMN is internally focused, and it's responsible for mind wandering, thoughts wandering freely, daydreaming, free association, self-referential thinking, that's thinking about oneself, contemplating the past, planning for your future, social cognition, that would be considering the perspectives and mental states of others, thinking about their intentions, recalling memories, so our episodic memory retrieval, simulating experiences like scene construction. So think of the brain, this is kind of like it's at recess. It's out there having fun, doing whatever it wants to do. That's the brain when the DMN is engaged. Now, in a neurotypical brain, the task positive network, the TPN, and the default mode network, the DMN, have an anti-correlate relationship. They function like a toggle. If the TPN is on, the DMN turns off. If the DMN is on, the TPN turns off. In an ADHD brain, this anti-correlate relationship breaks down. The DMN does not turn off when the TPN is engaged. So imagine focusing on a task while also contemplating why that coworker gave you that look, or running through simulating the conversation you need to have with your manager, or remembering that you're almost out of coffee at home and, oh my God, you need to buy coffee on your way home because if you don't buy coffee, you're not going to have coffee tomorrow morning, blah, blah, blah. All of this is running through your head while you're trying to focus on a task. This chatter never stops. It's kind of like having recess and your class all at the same time, all in the same space. Of course, it's going to be hard to focus. So that's the last part, the DMN. Now let's talk about treatments. There are, of course, chemical and behavioral treatments. So when looking at chemical treatments, a couple of important things to know. So while active in your body, they correct or compensate for the biological problem at the bottom of ADHD, which means that they normalize the behavior of about 2/3 of people with ADHD and still substantially improve the behavior of the last third. The positive change brought about by ADHD meds is probably unrivaled by any medication treatment for any other disorder in psychiatry. When taken as prescribed, the risk for addiction is low. And of course, there are stimulant and there's also non-stimulant medications available. So if Adderall or Ritalin is not your thing, you don't have to take that. Now, when it comes to behavioral treatments, very important thing to keep in mind. Treatments for ADHD will be most helpful when they assist you in doing what you know at the point of performance in the natural environment where you conduct your life. So if you learn something in a clinical setting, if it doesn't come to mind at the point of performance in your natural environment, then that skill is useless to us. So we need to learn the skills and be able to apply them at the point of performance. Now, more specifically, there's, of course, CBT, which is kind of the gold star standard in evidence-based talk therapy. Mindfulness, which is the skill of pausing before reacting. We train our mindfulness muscle with a meditation practice, usually, and it essentially allows us to choose differently from our first impulse. Then there's exercise, which I'm sure you've heard. There's a really interesting thing that happens with exercise, actually. So when it comes to our brain, when it comes to the neurons in our brain, we are born with all the neurons we're going to have. Our neurons are formed actually while we're in utero in our mother's belly. And once a neuron dies off, that's it. It's dead. That's why we have neurodegenerative diseases. There's one exception to this, and that exception is the hippocampus. Neurogenesis, or neuron creation, occurs in the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is actually smaller in ADHD brains, and the hippocampus is what is responsible for mood regulation, our working memory, memory encoding, all of that lives in the hippocampus. So exercise is one of the things that actually helps neurogenesis in the hippocampus. So it's the only one of the ways that we can create neurons in our hippocampus and therefore minimize these negative symptoms of having a smaller hippocampus and a dysregulated hippocampus. So in particular, exercise like complex cardio, like dance, martial arts, and team sports really helps with neurogenesis in the hippocampus. Then there is structure. We have a love-hate relationship with structure, but having clear structure and real tangible consequences really helps us. And by real tangible consequences, I mean both positive and negative. If a deadline is not a real deadline, we'll know it. We'll find out one way or another because we're going to try some way to move it. And if it's not a real deadline, then we'll know it. So having real immovables and real consequences for it really, really helps us because it helps us access that limbic system so that our limbic system isn't driving us instead. Now, when it comes to some techniques, more like specific techniques that I have found helpful, here are a couple. There is the Pomodoro timer, which you might have heard of. The idea there is that you set a timer for 25 minutes and you do the thing, whatever the thing is, for 25 minutes, and then you give yourself a 5-minute break. Now, the duration, it doesn't have to be 25 minutes. It could be an hour, it could be 10 minutes. But this is effective because it helps us with the transition. So even if we set a timer only for 10 minutes, it's like, hey, yes, I can commit to doing a thing only for 10 minutes. But then once I transition into doing the thing, then it's a lot easier to keep going and we actually don't need the timer afterwards. So when struggling to get started, it can be really, really helpful. Another technique is the 2-minute rule. If it's going to take you less than 2 minutes, then do it. Just do it right now. You got to send that text message. Don't put it off. Just do it right now. Then multitasking. So if we're not hyper-focusing, then we're going to be looking for stimulation. And if one particular task is not stimulating enough, then we're going to look for another task to do. So then intentionally multitask, especially the boring tasks. Towards that end, I found that picking the audiobook version is really, really helpful. So reading a book, for example, is something that you can't multitask. When you're reading a book, unless you are hyper focused on it and fully engaged and enthralled in the book, you're going to get bored. You're going to look for something else to do. But if you're listening to the book and you're consuming the content of the book, then you can multitask it. And it's a really great way to multitask, especially the boring tasks, like cooking while listening to a book, doing the dishes, painting that thing while you're also listening to a book or a podcast. And then there's this weird phenomenon called body doubling. I'm not really sure why this is effective, but being in a room with somebody else who's being productive helps us access our executive function, helps us access that productive energy. So if I have to work on my taxes, being in a room with somebody else who's also being productive on their computer helps me transition into that task. And now our last part, ADHD and development. So having ADHD as a developer, knowing what your brain struggles with and having workarounds for it can be really helpful. And also for people who want to know how they can be supportive of ADHD brains in the workplace, here's some suggestions. So we know that transitioning is hard. So minimize task switching. Having no meeting blocks can be really, really helpful for that, because then we can just do a deep dive and do some deep work. Blocking off the calendar, talk to your team about what days you can all agree on blocking off. Now, conversely, getting face-to-face time can actually be really helpful because it can help us access motivation and so enter that task. So having a conversation about something, a particular feature that needs to be developed, can get us excited, and then we want to go and build the thing. And then, of course, as I mentioned, body doubling can also be really helpful with transitioning. Now we have hyperfocus. You can leverage it to dive deep into your code. So if starting a PR at 10 p.m. when there are no distractions and you can just work on it until 4 a.m. and boom, get the thing done in one night instead of spending a whole week on it, if that works for you and you just talk to your team and have no meetings until 1 p.m. so you can still get decent sleep, do that. Talk to your team about it and leverage that. Leverage focus mode and do not disturb so that you're not getting pulled out of it when you are hyper-focused. And to support ADHD brains in that, if you do go into the office, if you see somebody with headphones in, that means don't disturb them. Don't interrupt me. Unless it's genuinely urgent, don't interrupt them. Message them on Slack instead. If they have do not disturb mode on, that means they're trying to focus. And if they don't, they'll see your Slack message and they'll come and talk to you. As I mentioned, structure can be really helpful. We have a love-hate relationship with it. When we lack structure, we're constantly chasing our limbic system. Our emotions are driving what we're doing. So having clear guidelines and clear consequences for achieving or not achieving whatever the tasks are can be very helpful for us. As I mentioned, multitasking. So if we're hyper-focusing, then we can just focus on one thing. But if we're not hyper-focusing, we're focusing on multiple things. So if we're trying to focus on one thing, but it's not stimulating enough, our brain will find a second thing. And toward that end, fidget toys can be really helpful. Because if you don't have something for your hands to do, your hands will find something to do, whether that'll be playing with your hair, picking at some scabs, biting your nails. Your fingers will find something to do, something else to occupy themselves. So instead, have a fidget toy or have something that you can fidget with. And if you're trying to be supportive of ADHD brains, if you see somebody with a fidget toy, don't judge them for using it, especially if they're using it while talking to you or in a meeting. Just understand that that actually helps them to focus on what you're saying rather than distracting them. And then there's burnout, which I know in G2I in particular is something that we talk about a lot about. With ADHD brains, since we have a deficit of executive function, we're constantly relying on our willpower to do the thing. And so we burn out really easily. So give yourself time to recover. Give yourself grace and time to recover. If you have a big deadline coming up, you have some feature you're working on and it's going GA soon, give yourself some time, a day or two off after the deadline so you can recover, because you know that you're relying on that willpower to get yourself through it. So give yourself time to recover so that you don't burn out. So that here are some resources, and I will happily share a link to this deck so you can look at this. There's two resources in particular I want to call out here. One is the book Taking Charge of Adult ADHD. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. The quotes that you saw me and a lot of the statistics came from this book, or they came from this article right here, the World Federation of ADHD International Consensus Statement. So it's like a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. They looked at pretty much any reliable research on ADHD, and based on that research, what conclusions can we draw about ADHD? And this is essentially a list of 208 facts that we know about ADHD based on the research. So most of the statistics I quoted to you guys came from one of those two sources, but there's also a lot of really great sources here as well. And I think that is everything. Thank you for listening.
All right. Thank you so much for Sophia for that. Yeah, I got a little clap in the chat here. Definitely one of the most active chats of the community events that we've done. I think you brought up a lot of really interesting points and topics, and you discussed this topic from a really broad range, discussing the neuroscience all the way to managing it as a software engineer and tips and tools, which I always love when we can walk away with something that we could start right now. Like when you mentioned the 2-minute rule, whew, am I guilty of not responding to a text because in my mind it feels like something way bigger than what it is right now, or I feel like, oh, this is going to start a conversation and I don't have time for this. But 2 minutes is it's actually a perfect amount of time. It allows you to gather your thoughts, get that text message out, and not put it off on the back burner. So I love that. That's personally something I'm going to take away from this. But we do have a Q&A. And so let me just readjust my screen so I can open that Q&A again. Okay, so I'm just going to go in order of what I see here. The first question here, my husband has ADHD and has been diagnosed and treated with Vyvanse for 2 years. My son has some symptoms and a lot of difficulty concentrating. Since it's hereditary, at what age can he start having tests to confirm and get treatments?
So this is a really interesting, great question. I don't have any kids, but my sister does, and I'm 99% sure that my nephew has ADHD, and it has been apparent to me since he was 3 years old. Legally, depending on where you are in the States, I believe legally a child can be diagnosed as early as 4. Before it used to be 6 years old. Now they're bringing it down to 4 because there's evidence to show that it is actually diagnosable as early as 3, 4 years old. I know in the UK, because that's where my sister lives, kids can't be diagnosed before 6. I also know, and this is anecdotal evidence. So one of the things I didn't touch on in this talk is that ADHD has a very high comorbidity rate with other disorders, particularly depression and anxiety. And when you look at the brain, it makes sense because there's a lot of overlap, like the DMN, overactivity in the DMN, that also happens in depression. So I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. The question was
About how early you can have tests for ADHD.
yes.
And you were mentioning your sister.
Oh, yeah. So when I look at people who I know in my adult life who have ADHD, but don't have comorbidities like depression and anxiety in a way that is crippling or having a significant impact on their life, it's almost always, not always, but for the most part, people who were diagnosed at an early age and had chemical treatment at an early age. So they never developed maladaptive coping mechanisms that led to the depression, anxiety, or other comorbidities. So to answer your question, if you're in the US, can be diagnosed as early as 4. And I personally do encourage early diagnosis because you start internalizing a lot of ADHD is a very silent kind of disease, and you internalize a lot of things. That's why it leads to depression and anxiety. So I encourage early diagnosis and early treatment, even if you choose to forego chemical treatment. behavioral interventions can also be really helpful.
Yeah. And again, the chat is just moving really fast on this one. But Eddie Freeman brought up a good point. Women and girls tend to get misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all. So definitely good to add in to the conversation as well. Um, Next question I have is ADHD. Oh, is this the next question? Nope, I skipped one. Sorry. Do you think a person with THC addiction could confuse their symptoms with ADHD? Or is it possible that a THC addicted person could be a symptom of having ADHD?
So it's a really interesting question. I'm not well versed on THC addiction, but one thing that I will tell you, when I learned, which was only this past summer, that the DMN doesn't shut off in an ADHD brain, I went on a big kick looking at, well, okay, how can I quiet my DMN? Not everyone has this experience of ADHD, but my experience of it is that my brain never shuts up. There's never a silent moment in my head. And so anything that can reduce the activity in the DMN, I'm curious about it. And actually, THC is one of the few things. So, Adderall, Ritalin, THC, and mindfulness are the three things that I have found that actually reduce activity in the DMN. So, my guess is that the THC dependency is a byproduct of untreated ADHD because it's the only way you can find any silence or peace. That would be my guess, but as I mentioned, I'm not well versed in THC addiction, so I recommend looking into it some more.
Okay. Good, fair enough question. When I read that one, I was like, that one's a tough one. But thank you for answering that. Okay, so next question. ADHD is becoming more widely discussed, and many people are self-diagnosing based on the symptoms they see in themselves. What are your thoughts on self-diagnosing ADHD?
That's such a good question. Um, I think there's a lot of things to keep in mind there. One is that sometimes getting a diagnosis can be cost prohibitive or prohibitive in other ways, because it can be hard, depending on where you live, to figure out how to get that diagnosis, how to see someone. Um, in some places, it requires a neuropsych assessment, and a lot of health insurance in the US will not cover that. So that's a couple $1,000s up front for something you're not even sure about. So keeping in mind that I do recommend getting a diagnosis if you can, but it can be cost prohibitive. Um, I think if you are looking, there's nothing wrong with self-diagnosing if you're just looking at behavioral interventions, because by and large, there are also things that will just help you be productive, even if you don't have ADHD. If you have a behavioral intervention that helps you do the thing, whatever the thing is, regardless of whether you have ADHD or not, that's a good thing. And I highly encourage that. Without an official diagnosis, you're not going to be able to get the chemical treatments. So if that is something that is important to you, then having an official diagnosis is important for that, and a self-diagnosis is not enough.
Right. Okay, thank you for answering that. I know it can be pretty, we have a lot of information online now, so it's that we're living kind of like in this time where we can get ourselves kind of like halfway there and get ourselves down a path. Like, I think it's pretty amazing that we can find information online and start to get clues as to what's going on. And then we can be more direct when we go to see a doctor and try and get all the way through, because I can't even imagine starting from zero and just not having any place to jump off of, and then going into, how long would it take to even get to the point where you take an assessment? Um,
I will say, I guess putting ethical questions of this aside, one of the things that cinched my diagnosis for me was actually I tried Adderall, and I went up to a decently high dose of Adderall before I felt any kind of um, neurotypical symptoms of Adderall. So any kind of jitteriness or heart palpitations or anything like that, I went to a high dose of it before I felt any of that. And for me, that kind of confirmed it, that because Adderall chilled out my brain, that yes, I have ADHD. Because if I didn't have ADHD, then I would have felt those symptoms much, much stronger. So for me, that was what cinched my diagnosis for me personally.
yeah, and that's actually a very common story. That's a very common experience as well. Um, so moving on to the next question, any tips for exasperated symptoms during tech interviews?
Oh God, that's such a good question. This is one of the reasons why I'm a big advocate of the take home, because when I get into my head and my DMN isn't shutting up while I'm trying to focus on the tech interview, and I have two or three trains of thought going, all while trying to accomplish a decently challenging algorithm. I don't have specific tips, aside from asking if a take home is available. If it's something that you have the privilege of having the time to do a take home, because if you have kids or something like that at home, it can be hard to find time to do a take home. Um, and failing that, I think practice is one of the best things. I noticed that my interviews got a little easier. When I do interviews, a lot of them, they go a little more smoothly because my brain is not getting in my way because I've done it so many times, if that makes sense. So I'm less, I don't know why, but so far that's the only thing that's been effective for me. But that one, if anybody has any good ideas or any good tips on, um, yeah, dealing with ADHD during a live tech interview, I would love to hear those because that's definitely a challenge. It's one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of the live tech interview.
Yeah, yeah. On the back of this question, Jamal asked, what kind of accommodations would it be useful to ask for during interviews? So aside from seeing if you can get it turned into a take home, is there anything else that comes to mind as an accommodation?
I think that would largely depend on how the ADHD presents itself for you. You know, for some people, having the pressure of a spectator will turn up the volume on their emotions and they'll be able to hyper focus and show up and do better. For somebody else, asking for their video to be off might be helpful because then they feel like they can actually think without somebody staring at them. So knowing yourself and maybe playing around with it and seeing what does help you to think better and think more clearly, and then requesting that.
I agree. I think it can present itself in many ways. So understanding yourself is really helpful. What are the main differences between normal procrastination and ADHD procrastination?
Oh, that is such a good question. So procrastination, uh, as a phenomena, we used to think that it used to be a time management skill or lack of, but it's not. Procrastination is actually an indication that there's an emotion you're avoiding. So in a neurotypical person, if they're procrastinating, then they're not procrastinating the task, they're procrastinating, they're putting off feeling the emotion that's associated with the task. So if you can separate that from yourself, in yourself, like, is there an emotion that's associated with this task that you're avoiding, or is it just transitioning into the task that's hard? And there's probably a couple ways you can answer that. One is, well, if you are somebody who is ask themselves about their emotions often, ask yourself, is there an emotion associated with it? Another thing is that if you do transition into the task and you're already in it, but you find reasons to get out of the task, then that's probably procrastination and there's some emotion associated with it that you're avoiding. But if you've transitioned into the task and you're rolling, then you know that it was more ADHD procrastination, more the difficulty with the transitioning rather than the task itself. Hopefully that was helpful.
That was enlightening for sure. I've never heard it framed like that. Okay, so we have officially diagnosed ADHD for 13-year-old girl. Does it make sense to ask for special treatment and medication?
Um, I mean, at 13 years old, she's a little adult, so I would recommend asking her and what would be helpful for her. Some people want the world want people to know that they have ADHD so that people can be accommodating. Other people don't want anyone to know that they have ADHD because they don't want the judgment that comes with it. And there's pros and cons to both, of course. So she might go one way or another. Maybe so. I think giving her the information and then enabling her to make that decision for herself and maybe experimenting with it. You know, maybe medication works, maybe it doesn't, maybe stimulants work, maybe non-stimulants are better. Maybe some specific accommodations would be helpful, or maybe they will be more detrimental because she needs more structure. I think experimenting with it, don't be shy to try things and say, no, this isn't working, or yes, this is working.
Great. Thank you. Actually leads in well to the next question. Any downsides of getting diagnosed? Wouldn't an official diagnosis stress someone out even more, especially those of us that have anxiety?
You know, it's interesting. I think that largely depends on you. Um, uh, Very individual. I was talking to a friend of mine and I was telling him about ADHD, and um, I don't know if I mentioned this, but there's a move in among researchers in ADHD to have ADHD renamed executive function deficit disorder. And I told him that, and he's neurotypical, and he's like, "Whoa, I wouldn't want that. That sounds so like you're broken." And my sentiment to that was like, well, yeah, that's what I'm trying to convey, is that like there's a serious deficit here and you're expecting me to behave neurotypically, but I can't. And so this is something that allows you to um, give somebody that grace and to receive that grace, right? But for some people, that validation might not be what they're lacking. Maybe they're not lacking validation. Maybe they are lacking privacy, and they just want everybody to stay out of their business and they want to handle it themselves. So, knowing yourself, and how you would respond is helpful. As an aside, I don't know about other countries, but in the US, in terms of like official diagnosis, it's not like it's anywhere in your chart. The only thing that would be in your chart would be like any records from specific appointments, or if you are on some kind of chemical treatment, that would be in your chart as well, because the prescription needs to be filled somewhere. So it's not like you have an official diagnosis somewhere in your chart. It's only an official diagnosis in whoever you choose to share it with. So who you choose to share it with or not share it with is entirely up to you. And that's a very, very subjective decision.
Mhm. Yes. We're going to take two more questions. We have 1 more minute left, but if we can extend it for two more questions, if that's okay. Again, like I think this is definitely the most active participation of any G2I event that we've ever held. So thank you everyone for everything that you're sharing in the chat. There's so much useful information. There's so many great stories and like just really informative stories that everybody's sharing that I think is really adding to the conversation. So I'll just ask two more questions here. Any advice on not getting into rabbit holes or perfectionism? For example, spending several days on your code editor config when you have more important things to do.
That's such a good question. I think uh, having check-ins with yourself, of asking yourself, is this my top priority? Because remember, with ADHD, understanding what is important to do right now is really hard for us. So, like, yes, for example, when I was working on this deck, I spent way too long on the styling of this deck before I ever put any content into it. And when I am developing, it's the same thing. I will get something CSS pixel perfect before I add the functionality to it. Is that the important thing? No, it's not. And so adding little check-ins, maybe a random Slack notification, like at some random time during the day or several times during the day, you set a reminder, it's like, hey, are you actually working on the important thing? And have that be a little check-in with yourself and like, oh, actually, no, I'm down this rabbit hole. Let me refocus. My priority right now is this task in Jira. Let me get back to it. So having some little things like that force you to check in with yourself as to whether you're working on your top priority or not. I think that's the only thing that I have found to be helpful so far. If other people have other ideas, I would love to hear them.
I love that. I do that too. I actually, when I just rebuilt like made our new website for React Miami, I reframed it as like the CSS is like the little treat that I get. It's my reward. So get all
Nice.
the
Yes.
functionality for something working all the way through so that you know it can be done, because there's nothing worse than spending so much time on styling and you're like, oh, this implementation direction isn't even gonna work.
Yes,
And
exactly.
so you're like, I like get it working end to end, and then your reward at the end is to style it. So I just like made it
That,
my carrot at the end of the stick.
I like that. I like that. I tried to do that with this deck. It didn't work. But
Well,
I
I will
finished the
also
deck.
say your deck was beautiful too,
Thank
like one
you.
of the best decks we've seen as well. Um, so last question. Another concern with telling an interviewer, a hiring manager, or a potential employer that you have ADHD has the potential to scare that respective person or compa that you
Company, probably.
company that you sorry, there's mm, offer. Sorry, I'm trying to think. It says you hand maybe that you scare the
That you
respective.
have off from interviewing.
There you go. Have off from interviewing or hiring the ADHD individual. What is your stance on telling the employer when you need a special consideration, such as doing a take-home code challenge versus a live coding interview? Good question.
That is such a good question. And I don't have a good answer for that one. That's something I'm still trying to assess for myself as well. I have never asked for accommodation. Um, I would like to, but I am afraid that, I mean, I know technically, legally, they can't not hire someone because they have ADHD. At the same time, if you're hiring someone to do the thing and they can't do the thing, then that's grounds for letting them go. So it's a hard one to make a decision on, and I don't have a good answer for that. If somebody else has any suggestions or recommendations, I'm all ears. Um, I think you can ask for specific accommodations and say, I would rather not say why I'm requesting this. If that's possible, I would just like to keep it private. If they force the issue, then you can. On the other hand, if you have the luxury of being picky with your employer, then you can tell them and see how they react to it and see how accommodating they are to brains with ADHD. And if they're really accommodating, then you know, hey, this is a place I want to work. And if they immediately dismiss you for it and don't even give you a chance, then you don't want to be on that team. But that is something that's only a luxury for those who have the option of choice. And very often for us ADHD brains, we don't have that option of choice because as soon as we met the bare minimum, the MVP, our effort goes out the window. So as soon as we have one offer, it becomes really, really hard to drive ourselves to keep working towards multiple offers so that we have that choice. So it's like it's a tricky one for sure.
Yeah, very tough. A lot of cultural, like, you know, things there too. It's, I think, really a big question. Um, and I wouldn't know how to answer that one either. But in any case, I think that this was a great discussion. Again, thank you everyone for participating in the chat. Thank you so much, V, for joining us today and for sharing all of your insights. This was a long time coming, this talk, and it's been on our minds for a long time. And I'm so glad you and Thea were able to connect to set this up because I just think that this was such a wonderful discussion and I really appreciate it and your time. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you at the next community event. Bye,
Thank
guys.
you, everyone.